Well, it's a beautiful Thursday, the 6th of June in the year 2024. Thank you so much for making time to join us this evening for this exclusive edition of This Day. I'm your host. My name is Andrew Mwansa. Zambia and the International Monetary Fund have reached a staff-level agreement on economic policies and reforms following the successful third review of the Extended Credit Facility Program. The staff-level agreement includes a request made by government to access an additional $388 million to preserve macroeconomic stability and support response to external shocks. The staff-level agreement, subject to approval by the IMF Executive Board, will guide program implementation for the next 12 months and trigger the fourth disbursement of about $187 million upon approval. The IMF noted that the ongoing drought has created a more challenging economic environment and commended Zambia for targeting emergency relief to the most vulnerable, while sustaining fiscal consolidation efforts to restore debt sustainability, tighten monetary policy to curb inflation, while maintaining the exchange rate flexibility. Tonight we get to put everything into context. What does this decision mean? But also, how does the outlook of the economy look like for the rest of the year? Trevor Hambayi is the economist. He joins me on this edition of This Day. Mr. Hambayi, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us on This Day tonight.
Good evening to you, and thank you for having me.
We've reached a staff-level agreement with the IMF, which includes a request to access an additional $388 million to preserve macroeconomic stability and support response to the external shocks. I want to find out from you how key, this development is for our country.
So, firstly, I think it's a very positive development in terms of the country. The financing by the IMF, which is this loan facility that we have, is called the Extended Credit Facility, which is the $1.3 billion that we got as financing to support the country during its debt restructuring. This $1.3 billion is going to be paid over 3 years. So essentially that is split into a couple of payments, 3 payments or 4 payments a year of around $400 million for the next 3 years. What they have now requested for in terms of, firstly, the first one is that the staff level agreement is the one which basically confirms the fact that the macroeconomic fundamentals that we agreed to be able to reach with the IMF in terms of the payment structure have been reached. So that is a positive thing, that the country is in a position where there are specific macroeconomic indicators which it has reached as benchmarks for this funding to be made. This is where that $187 million is going to come through as a third payment. The additional amount that they're asking for, $388 million, I would reckon this is an amount that they're trying to be able to use towards mitigation of the impact of the drought. The $308 million might be an advance payment from the already approved fund of $1.3 billion, or there's a possibility that it could be an additional amount that we're asking over and above the $1.3 billion. Irrespective, you know that a couple of weeks ago the president declared a disaster in terms of our drought position. Yeah. With that drought position, the country has gone onto the international market to try and raise $900 million. That $900 million obviously has to come from different partners to be able to do this. This might be one that we're asking the $308 million to cover a component of that $900 million. Essentially is that this amount we are supposed to be able to use to be able to deal with drought, the impact of the drought. And there are a number of areas where it comes. The first one, in terms of the drought, obviously it creates an issue of food insecurity, is that we'll have a challenge around the availability of our staple food, which is maize, and then we might have to import a finished product to be able to meet the country's requirement. The second one is that with the impact of the drought is that we've also had the issue where you see the load shedding. And one of the measures that the country might be considering to be able to deal with this is having to be able to import electricity from our neighboring countries. These funds are then available to be able to utilize for that purpose. And technically that is where we would be in terms of the staff level agreement. But there's obviously positives that we as a country are staying in line with what we agreed with IMF to be able to meet the conditions that will allow us to be able to receive the financing.
Obviously, the ventilator for us to be able to address the impact that comes with the drought is the $900 million that we are, begging for from the international community and our partners. But do you find some of the mitigative measures that this government has put up sufficient to address, the ongoing drought?
So, Andrew, first from having to do with that question, I think we must look at the historical position of the country. Is that as a country we have done insufficient to be able to deal with specific challenges that the country is going to face. The reality is, the issues around the drought, firstly, is that we should have known El Nino has been with us for a number of years. It's more than 20 years when this phenomenon came into place. So essentially what it says is that it doesn't matter what happens, there will be a period when you will have a drought. You know it's coming. So essentially we should have been prepared for this a long time ago. Secondly is that 2015 we had this drought again. And at that time, we also got to a position where we had insufficient water to be able to generate electricity. We went into load shedding. At that time, we should have started to be able to work towards having to create the mitigating factors to create power generation outside hydro. This has been 9 years later, and we're still in exactly the same position as we were. In our infinite wisdom as a country, in 2015, when we had the drought and we couldn't generate sufficient power, we went and borrowed $2.4 billion to do another hydro station on the same river that had insufficient water to supply the first one. So this is very poor judgment on our side. So when you're talking about the current government right now, is that when this current government came into office, we were actually just gravitating between load shedding and not. We had actually experienced it before. Of course, when there's an election year, they kind of wash these things away, that they don't show us what the real challenge is. So essentially is that even at that time when they came into office in 2021, we knew that we have got an issue around power generation. There were very good pronouncements at the time that this issue around load shedding is a thing of the past, it will not happen. But we are back here, and it is even worse than it has ever been. I think as a nation, this is the worst that we've ever seen it to be. The problem about mitigation factors that are speaking to either having to do with the drought, which is food security, or having to do with load shedding, is that the solutions to these are long term. You can't solve them in the short term. Essentially now where we are is that for us to be able to deal with this challenge, outside us having to import the power, is that we have to generate additional resources of power generation, which is solar energy. And those ones take a couple of months before you can do. Even the quickest one is between 6 and 8 months to do a solar plant. If we decide to do a very small one in every geographic locations, then to feed into the power grid. But the second one is that obviously one of the challenges that we do have is that the implementation of such projects should be done by the private sector. We've got a very bad attitude of having to be able to drive everything in terms of having to drive economic recovery for the country through government. The people that should be driving this is the private sector. And with the private sector is a question of creating an opportunity for them to generate revenue. They will take up that space. The challenge that we've had now is that we are protecting ZESCO. Anybody who wants to generate power has to sell that power to ZESCO at a price that is not competitive. And this is where the problem is. ZESCO does not want to let go of the distribution, production, and supply. So we needed to be able to resolve this, and this would then solve our power generation issue in a very, very short period of time, because it will create a business opportunity for the private sector to invest in.
Stand by the majority of businesses in this country are small and medium, businesses, and obviously these are being affected largely, by the ongoing, load shedding. Paint to us a picture in terms of the economic implication of this extended 12 hours of load shedding on businesses.
It's a very unfortunate situation. Firstly is that in where the economy is at the moment is a very difficult position for an SME as well as an ordinary Zambian, because of the fact that the cost of living has been going up since 2015. In 2015, our exchange rate, or our kwacha, depreciated from 6 kwacha to $1 to 15 kwacha. And then this has continued from then in 2016, 2017, that from 15 kwacha, we are now at 26 kwacha. This is taking away all your capacity of any revenue that you have generated. But the impact of this is that you must look at this from historic point again. 2015, during the when we had 8-hour load shedding period, the economy contracted by 23%. That 23% is speaking to just under $5 billion. If you wanted to do it in kwacha, is that this is 125 billion kwacha. That is our entire budget for 1 year as a country. Is that the enterprises lost that money because you lose productivity. Now, the ones that are majorly affected by that issue of having to lose productivity and revenue generation are SMEs. Whatever happens in this period is that you will find a lot of SMEs that will generally shut down. They'll be unable to sustain their business. And having to do this, firstly, they'll start by having to reduce their staff levels, and secondly, is that they will actually shut down as an enterprise. And this always affects the SMEs. We should have had statistics that are actually speaking to this so that we appreciate what this means. Now, one of the biggest challenges that we have as a country is employment creation. The empirical evidence states that 4 out of every 5 jobs that are created in an emerging economy like Zambia are created by an SME. So essentially, we are taking the very basic root foundation of where we should be creating employment by having this load shedding.
We're privileged as a country to have the Ministry of, of Small and Medium Enterprises. Do you think in this critical time, the ministry is exhibiting relevance in terms of addressing some of these critical issues that you're talking about, Mr. Hambayi?
I think we've got a bit of questions around what the Ministry of SME is doing. Firstly, in terms of the Ministry of SME, is the fundamental issue I would have expected the ministry to be doing is to be able to create a conducive business environment for the SME sector to operate. One of the factors that is speaking to you creating a conducive business environment is that there must be policies that are speaking to SMEs. There must be incentives that are speaking to SMEs. There must be access to finance for SMEs that have been facilitated through this ministry. I have not seen any of those factors come into play. If you think about what is happening in terms of the economy in our country, is that as a government, we are driving an agenda of having to be able to push FDI, foreign direct investors, to come into the country to invest. And in having to do this, we're giving them incentives. Okay, there are fiscal incentives. These incentives must be given to Zambian entities. We cannot compete at the same level as foreign direct investors. So if you want to be able to get the incentives as a Zambian, you have to compete at the same level, that you must go and invest $250,000 or $500,000, depending on where you're investing it, for you to be accorded the same incentives. As a Zambian, we do not have access to these funds. We do not have the same kind of financial capacity as the foreign entities. So we should have a special incentives that is speaking to local enterprises. And this is the issue that we expect the Ministry of SME to be able to address, is the first one. The second one is speaking to tax issues. So if you look at foreign entities, they're given 5-year tax holiday for which they're paying nothing. Then the next 5 years is that it's graduating before it gets to actual rate. So if you look at the local SME, is that they're being charged 4% turnover tax, which is charged on a monthly basis. If you compute this, this is around between 40 and 44% tax for the year. Now, that rate is the highest tax rate there is in the country for any business enterprise, whether it is the financial institutions or the mines. So you are expecting the SME, who is the smallest entity that requires support in this country, to pay the highest tax in the country, while you are saying that the SME should be driving economic growth. Is that the business environment for an SME in this country is actually hostile. And until we can address this, there's a very important aspect why we must address the SME. Firstly is that 97% of all the private sector in this country are SMEs. Then the SMEs are also the ones that are speaking to the grassroots in the country. Is that they are the ones that run businesses that is speaking directly to you and me as an enterprise. And the third aspect is that if we want to be able to reduce poverty in this country, that is where we should start from in terms of reducing. But I also mentioned the issue around creation of employment. If we want to create employment, that is the sector that we want to employ. We want to support because it creates the highest number of employment in the country.
Another issue that we've noticed the past couple of months is how the kwacha has been, on a downtrend. It's been appreciating, depreciating. Now, as we speak, it's trading, to 26 kwacha to $1. I think the biggest question, Mr. Hambayi, is what exactly is happening to our currency?
What do you call it? When the chickens come to roost, okay? Is that the strategy that we've been taking as a country is not directed at getting us out of the solution. It is the one that is looking at having to be able to deal with the short-term challenge. We have not put in place a long-term solution that actually takes the country out of this cyclical space where the kwacha is fluctuating and is highly volatile. The first aspects that you do see around the kwacha is the reason why we have this volatility in the exchange rate is that we've got a higher demand than supply, which means that we are importing more than we are exporting. Basically is that you are spending more than you are making. Okay? This is what puts pressure on the exchange rate. The fundamentals, we must look at why there is that pressure. The one thing that I think is driving the pressure on the exchange rate is because our economy is driven by foreign entities. The major component of our economy is foreign entities, and all of them are generating revenue, which they are externalizing. You start with the mining sector that generates 70% of our hard currency. They are externalizing those resources if we are lucky enough for the funds to even come. That is the first aspect. The second aspect is that if you look at every other sector of our economy, okay, whether you're looking at wholesale and retail trade, whether you're looking at ICT, whether you're looking at construction, all the major players that are running these economies, these sectors, are international companies. What it means is that for all the revenue they are generating, they are also externalizing. And this is where our biggest challenge as a country comes in. If we start to support our SME sector, is that the SMEs is local. As soon as they start to contribute more to the economy, we'll start to have the hard currency that we're generating staying in the country. And you must remember, all these other companies that are in the other sectors in ICT, or your mobile service providers who are externalizing the funds, are generating this money in kwacha. Then they go and convert it to hard currency to externalize it, which is the same thing wholesale and retail trade. All the chain stores are externalizing. Now, in terms of our approach, what the central bank has done in trying to be able to deal with this challenge is to want to reduce the kwacha so that we're not buying the dollar. Where they're reducing the kwacha is not where the problem is. Where they're reducing the kwacha is between you and me in terms of reducing liquidity. The ones who have the kwacha that is buying the dollar are the companies that are generating the revenue. They will still have the money to externalize. So one of the reasons why this approach has not worked is that we are squeezing the kwacha side when the problem is on the dollar side.
The dollar side.
Is that the principal strategies that we must take must speak to the dollar side.
What must we do? What must we do, Mr. Hambayi? So, I think the biggest question also is, why have we failed to do the right thing?
So the long-term solution is that we need to be able to drive an agenda where the country is achieving what we call a trade surplus. We are generating more revenue than we are spending in hard currency. So we need to increase the export base, that we're exporting more than we are importing. Is the ultimate long-term solution. In the short term now, in able to deal with this challenge, is that we must enforce all the regulations that require us to retain the hard currency in the country. And the basic one says there is foreign exchange controls in the country, that you cannot just externalize money out of this country. Is that under the conditions that we have as a country, is that the investors that come into the country can externalize their profits, okay? Which is basically mid-year or end of the year. In having to do this is that they must have declared what their profits are, and then they have also paid their tax obligation. The profit they can externalize. But what we see currently is that there is a daily externalization of hard currency by these multinationals. And this is what is putting pressure on us. The amount that the country is asking, the $388 million that we're asking to be able to bring into the country to deal with all these issues that we're having around the impact of drought and the instability in our macroeconomic indicators, one of the areas we continue to be able to do this is that we're taking the hard currency and doing it to shore up the market, that's to reduce the demand and put the hard currency on the market. This is depleting our reserves. It is so unfortunate as a country, if you did ask, is that for 20 years we have been talking about our reserves being sufficient to cover 3 months of import cover. It is, I can't understand that thinking, because the country is growing, the country is developing, the economy is growing. How can we remain at 3 months import cover? In principle, that amount that we're talking about should be what we consider as a sovereign wealth fund, okay? And that fund should be able to say we have sufficient resources in our wealth fund to cover 50% of our debt position, which is we must have $6 billion sitting in that account, because this is what is the country's reserves. Why are we in a position where, as a country, we have got all the mineral resources that we are exporting, we are generating revenue that we are paying to government, and we still remain with only 3 months of import cover?
Does it ignite any form of hope within your heart, Mr. Hambayi, with the good news that is coming out of our mining sector? Now Mopani, is back full-fledged running. KCM, the president, gives an indication that very soon also, it's gonna start running to its full capacity. With these two giant mines that we have in our country, and mining being the major foreign earner for our country, foreign exchange earner for our country, doesn't it spark any hope that perhaps things might get better in terms of the volatility of our exchange rate?
Andrew, let's be realistic. Firstly, I find it very unfortunate that the country is where it is today. Remember that our major foreign exchange earner in this country is copper exports. And in the period between 2008 coming to 2014, the country increased its capacity to be able to increase copper production. We actually came from around 300,000 metric tons to 800,000 metric tons. And one of the factors that was driving this is that the fact of these mines, KCM or Pani ore, came into full production. Okay? Now, if you look at the period that we are in now, this is 2023, if you go back to around 2019, 2018, the price of copper on the international market had gone to its best value, between 9,000 and 10,000. Okay? It is projected that going into 2030, we might get to 13,000 per metric tons because of obviously the growth in the electric vehicle industry. Now, this is the period when we are selling our copper at the highest price we've ever been able to sell it, and yet we have got challenges with our hard currency. There is a problem. So technically speaking, the revenue we're generating from the mining sector is not in this country. If it was, we would not be in this problem. So essentially, I have got a very serious reservations for whether Pani or KCM coming online is going to change our position. Remember, we have been in this high-value production for the last 3 years.
Where do we seem to get it wrong? I think majorly, if there's two countries that are given as an example of countries that have done so well with their mining sector, is Botswana and Namibia. They seem to have gotten the equation right. Well, possibly and potentially, do you think we miss it in terms of maximizing the potential that our mining sector has?
So there are a lot of times when I question the commitment of our leaders to the goodness of our country. Is that, are we acting in the best interest of our country as leaders that are running their affairs for the benefit of the people? So the first thing is that the mining sector has not done what it should be doing for our country. They are generating the highest revenue and they are paying the least amount of tax. You and me are paying more tax to our treasury than the mining sector because of the volume of what, if you look at in terms of percentage of how much you make and how much tax you pay and how much the mines makes and how much tax they pay. So technically is that where we have gotten it wrong, firstly, is obviously the tax base that we have is not good enough. But secondly is because we have sold all our best resources to foreign entities. Where have you had a position where you are thinking that you want to go to London today and you are thinking about what you're going to be able to do to develop the UK? You never think that way. It's the same principle that any investor that comes into here, they don't come here to develop the country. They come here to be able to exploit the resources that they can for their benefit. And generally, we must act in our best interest before we get to a position where we're giving this. So the first thing I keep saying is that the mines must be owned by Zambians. Yes, it is. We need international partners. We can give them equity in there, that there's a percentage that they take, but a minimum of 50% must be retained in this country. And I want KCM to be owned by a Zambian. This is what we should be doing. So in terms of where we're going forward, is that can we create a strategy where we have created a fund that allows Zambians to be able to tap into, to go into mining, and they'll be able to own the mines as Zambians. This is what is going to start to sort our problem out. Right now, I think what we have is political freedom. We do not have economic freedom. There are 240 multinationals in this country that contribute 62% to our GDP. Essentially, is that 240 companies are taking 62% of our entire economy out of the country. Is that this is an issue where we have not been able to create employment in the country for a very long time, but we see the economy having to grow. We have also not been able to reduce poverty. Actually, poverty has increased. Now it is worse off than we were 20 years ago. 20 years ago, we were at 56%. Now we are at 61% in terms of poverty. That is people living in extreme poverty below $2.10 a day. So 60% of our entire population, 60 years after independence, can barely afford to put a meal a day on their table.
Do we have an economic strategy for recovery as a country, especially we're coming from an era where we had the COVID-19 pandemic? Now we're speaking of the amount of debt that we had contracted, which this government managed successfully to restructure about 77% of our debt. Do we seriously have an economic strategy really for recovery as a country?
So I have said this before. I have not seen and I have not heard where the economic recovery is, which is the position where we are right now, is that I do not see where our economic recovery strategy is, because if you look at the 3 years that the UPND has been in government, is that we've been talking about debt restructuring. And that
isn't it important?
It is important. I'll come to that point. But as a country, we need to delink our economic strategy from the political agenda. The first thing that you do see is that from all the politicians, all the political parties that have come into office, every time they come, they want to tell us what they are going to do for us. They want to tell us how they're going to grow the economy. And this has not worked for us. Every time we're going back, a new party comes, we are starting all over again. What we should have is a 40-year, a 50-year economic strategy as to where we want the country to be. We have determined what we want to achieve. So for a very simple example is that what we'll be saying is...
But don't we have the national development plans?
We are changing the national development plan every year. But listen to this. If we determine that by the year 2030, we want to have 10,000 kilometers of road network across the country, or for us to be able to finish the road network in the country is that there's 20,000 kilometers. And we give ourselves 20 years, which basically says every year we have to do 1,000 kilometers. And we put this into our economic strategy, that every year any government that comes into office must build 1,000 kilometers of road. So it doesn't matter who comes. Our economic strategy is very clear about where we're going. This will be the same thing about how many schools you want, how many housing units you want, how many hospitals you want. You would have determined what you want. And then every government that comes must meet that minimum threshold that we have set for them. Remember, when they come into government, they tell us that they are our employees, that they are our civil servants. We must tell them what they must do for us as a country. But they tend to come into office, they tell us what they're going to do, how much they're going to pay themselves. This is not working. So essentially, if we had that strategy, is that we have a country economic strategy for which we are pushing.
We've heard on a number of forums the President making mention that the debt restructuring is a precursor for economic recovery and economic takeoff.
Absolutely. I totally agree. It's a precursor. But let me also say this. The precursor is in the fact that once we have finished our debt restructuring basically simply says that we reduce the amount of money that we pay in debt servicing on an annual basis. That money that we save, we use it to be able to drive economic recovery domestically. Okay? But let's look at where we are as a country. That position of having to have money that we can use to be able to spend domestically, we achieved in November 2020. In November 2020, we defaulted on our loan repayment. When we defaulted on loan repayment, we stopped making any payments towards debt service. The country fell under a program called DSSI, Debt Service Suspension Initiative, which was an IMF program. And they suspended any payments until we have finished restructuring, and that's where we have not been paying for 3 years. Now, at that time, it meant that the money that we should have been paying for service was actually available for us to use. When we finish the debt restructuring right now, we'll be worse off than we have been in the last 3 years. Because we'll actually start paying, but it's a small amount, but we'll start paying when we have not been paying. What has happened is that, yes, we did achieve that position. The New Dawn government then decided to spend this money. And you know where that money went. Free education, university bursaries, FISIP program, social cash transfer. All those things is cash that we are spending that we don't have. The unfortunate thing is that we are actually having to do a debt restructuring right now, but we are still borrowing to be able to finance our budget.
Was that a good strategy?
It is a very poor strategy. It's exactly the same strategy we came from.
So we shouldn't have restructured our debt?
No. We should have restructured our debt. Our debt we required to restructure because we got to a point where we cannot afford to pay to meet the payments of our debt servicing. So yes, we should have restructured it. The question is, what have you done after you restructure is the important aspect, which is exactly the question that we should have been asking ourselves now, that as soon as we finished restructuring, what is it that we're going to do that is going to ensure that we can
You don't think it was a right strategy for government to consider social spending, financing free education, increasing CDF, because you're saying this is money that we don't have as a country. So was it a bad decision for government to take that route?
It is not a bad decision. There are a lot of vulnerable people in this country, and firstly, free education is one of the only other ways that you and me will benefit from the country's resources. So it is a good thing. CDF is a good thing that we need to be able to start to have development in the rural areas. That is a good thing. The bursaries for education is a good thing. But remember, I keep saying, any social spending must be supported by revenue. Are you generating the money to do this? If you're not generating the money, is that this is a very short-term process where things will fall apart.
Is that your prediction?
Is technically speaking, right now we are taking money, borrowing money to take it into social spending. Clear position where we will fall into a debt crisis in just a matter of time. It's just a question of when, which is the same thing that we have done with our debt restructuring. So our debt restructuring is a very good thing for us, for us to have the leg room, the fiscal space for us to be able to recover. But in the meantime, as we're recovering, we must have a repayment strategy as to how we're going to repay that loan that we have restructured to another date. And at the moment, I have not heard how we have planned to be able to be speaking to paying this debt.
The sinking fund that was put up.
But we've heard the story about the sinking fund. This sinking fund started in the previous government. When this new government came, they told us that there was nothing in the sinking fund. And generally speaking, if you're telling me about the sinking fund, is the reserves that we have are speaking to the sinking fund. But those reserves are not enough. 3 months import cover. So if we are setting it outside, and if we are going to set it out, I needed it to be a bill that is passed in Parliament, which basically says 5%, whatever figure you figure out, whether it's 10% of all government revenue, any tax they raise, must go into the sinking fund.
Now, before any debt is contracted, it has to pass through Parliament, and for Parliament to approve the debt. Isn't this a position in the right direction?
It's in the right direction, Andrew. But we must be realistic. We have been there before. Is that the reason we are in this position is because the legislature, which is Parliament, the executive, which is Cabinet, both failed this country in having to enforce those regulations that are stipulated as part of management of our fiscal position.
Speaking about the economic recovery program and some of the things that government has put in, up to address the issues of the economy, I'd like to find out your position over the decision that the central bank made to increase the MPR.
The MPR is an interesting position that the central bank has taken for a very, very long time. Is that we have continued to be able to increase the monetary policy rate, and in having to do this is that we're driving an agenda of trying to get inflation to remain between 6 and 8%. I totally believe that the inflation rate is not our priority as a country right now. Our priority, firstly, our priority as a country now is the high cost of living. To be able to address the high cost of living.
Isn't it that, Mr. Hambayi, when we arrest inflation, then we arrest the increase in the cost of...
No. Even when you succeed with inflation at 6 to 8%, all you are saying is that we have succeeded to be able to reduce the rate at which the cost of living is only going up by 6 to 8%. But the cost will still be going up. So I would be saying that is not a solution. The solution is that I must give you, put you in a position as an ordinary Zambian to generate sufficient income that is growing above 6 to 8%, so that you can afford to buy the goods even if they go up, which is the crisis that we have around Milimil, is that it has been going up on a regular basis, but it is consistent with the inflation in the country. But there's an uproar because people cannot afford it. Not because it's become expensive, it is because their incomes have not grown at the same rate as that price. If they were generating sufficient income to them they would be able to afford the minimum even if it was going up. And technically, as a country, you can't hold the price of minimum, or any product for that matter.
As we conclude, Mr. Hambayi, do you see things changing in the next 2 years, looking at the current economic condition that we are faced by? Do you see a better Zambia in the next 2 years, where the exchange rate will no longer be volatile, where we're going to have an affordable cost of living and a better livelihood for our people?
Very interesting question, Andrew, that you ask. But let me ask a counter question for you. If you had asked yourself this question 20 years ago, that do I see a better Zambia? Technically speaking, yes, we do see a better Zambia, but the levels of improvement to our lives are very minimal because of the revenue that we're generating. The empirical evidence says that we are poorer now as Zambians than we were 20 years ago. Because then you're looking at a measure which is speaking to your per capita income. How much do you earn? So if you look at this in real value in terms of dollars that you're earning that time and what you could buy with the current dollars that you're buying now, you'll find that your position is not as good.
The reason I ask like this is because when the UPND came into government in 2021, the argument is that our GDP was about $18 billion, and now we've doubled our GDP, and as we get into the next year, the projections are that we'll keep increasing our GDP.
Our GDP is increasing, okay? But what we are also not throwing into the discussion is at what rate our population is growing. If you look at this is what is going to determine what your per capita income is. So, when the UPND government came into office in 2021, it was just post-COVID, okay? And if you're looking at 2014, 2015, our GDP at that time had gotten to $27 billion. We are not back at $27 billion. So we haven't yet gotten to the position where we had been in 2015, which was one of the periods when Zambia was experiencing its best economic growth. And then at the moment, we're talking about an increase of 2%, 2.7%. It's a very small increase. Remember, if you talk about 2.7%, the population is between 2.8 to 3% in terms of growth.
Yeah.
What is going to happen is that it means that particular year you will actually reduce by -1. Because your population is faster than your GDP. So essentially, is that it is so important. I mean, look, there are a lot of things that we could say, but the fact that 61% of our population are living below the poverty bottom line of $2.01 says a lot of things about what we have not done right. And if you want to measure what is our capacity, is that you must ask yourself where Zambia is now to where it was 60 years ago, and compare this to a country like Singapore, who were in a worse position than us.
Mr. Trevor Hambayi, thank you so much for joining us on this day tonight.
It was a pleasure.
I was speaking to Economist Trevor Hambayi. Thanks so much for watching this day. See you again on Tuesday at exactly 21:15. Good night.